Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Open Peace podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to be joined again by Tal Hagin. Thank you for joining us again, Tal. It's a pleasure to have you back. And we're going to be discussing some very interesting topics tonight. So we're going to be looking at woke culture, virtue signaling, privilege, trigger warning, safe spaces. Now, these terms are obviously bounced around a lot. I don't have a full understanding of them. So, Tal, how about you try and help me out and educate me a little bit on these terms?
Hi. So it's really a pleasure to be back on the podcast and discuss this topic. This sways away a bit from the things that I'm usually discussing. My main focus is on issues pertaining to Israelis and Palestinians, but there are a lot of different side topics that I feel that are important to discuss, and so I reached out to the Open Peace podcast to discuss this. Because when it comes to more generally considered left-wing arguments, as we said, privilege, safe spaces, triggers, virtue signaling, a lot of people on the right, but also a lot of people I think would in general kind of retract at these different buzzwords because of how they've been portrayed in the media, how they've been discussed by individuals at protests or in government. And I do believe that a lot of these different terms, the actual meanings behind them and what they're trying to convey are incredibly important to us as a society. But due to the fact that I would say that the far left and these different what we would consider left-wing groups kind of go off the charts with the terminology, it takes away from the core underlying meaning. So the first thing, when I say left and right, the way that I differentiate the two is left-wing. The left usually focuses on the collective, and the right usually focuses on the individual. So either we're talking about, that's why, for example, welfare or social programs are usually a left-wing topic, and personal freedoms, freedom of speech, the right to personal safety, freedom from intervention from the government would be a more right-wing because it's about the individual being responsible for his own open markets. And then this goes down to socialism, communism, and capitalism, the different economic structures. Sure. So I would say that during the 60s and later on, actually even during the suffrage, in the last century, actually, because of course this isn't just bound to the United States or one certain area in the world. This has been ongoing ever since, I would say, the Enlightenment of slowly. First, we started viewing each other as individuals, which is what allowed for monarchies to lose their place in society. Also, religion lost its place in a lot of different societies as the main power structure, because people started looking at each other as individuals, as humans, and let's focus on human studies and on the individual and what rights should we have? What is it? What are these, innate rights that humans have? That civil war in France that was fought against the rich and the monarchy was for their own rights and for it to be equal. And the treaty for human rights was written by the French after this revolution. And the thing that's important to understand is that then came into, who becomes about equality and who should be thinking about. Because remember, even during these times when, very, very famous and well-understood philosophers or thinkers or individuals were talking about, freedom for all and everyone is equal, they weren't actually talking about everyone. It usually didn't include women. It didn't usually include minorities of that country. And so anyone who wasn't them essentially wasn't equal. It would be, for example, for Europe, it would be the white man with owning property. They would be the ones who would be equal amongst each other, and everyone else wouldn't be, for either scientific reasons or religious reasons that they came up with, or just social reasons that they said, women or minorities don't have these certain rights. And I think as we continued to go along, and especially after World War II, the focus on the collective and what we can do for one another became more and more prevalent, and kind of like looking back at society and our past, because I think a lot of the times we focused in the past on going forward, and we didn't look back at what we were actually doing. I would say that, for example, so this goes into the terms. Privilege, I think, is one of the biggest terms that has been completely destroyed of its original meaning. Privilege, so it's usually the way that we hear it in media is white privilege. Privilege is certain attributes that you have, or certain characteristics in your life, or things that are around you that you have because of a certain trait, either because you come from a rich family, you're white, or you're simply the color of the majority of that country. For example, if you live in Egypt, if you're white, for example, you're going to be looked at very differently there. So it really depends on where you live, and so these privileges. So for example, if we go with the very stereotypical, the white straight male, that's the privilege. That's kind of like what the American Western left discusses. What does it mean? So they would say, if you were to ask most people what this means, it means that, they are inherently, like me as a white and straight male, that I have a much easier life than everyone else. And so what this essentially does is people who are, white and just like me, but they have a horrible life. They live in poverty. They don't have a good life. They listen to these type of words, and they're like, what are you talking about? What privileges do I have? I work paycheck to paycheck. I'm not able to barely afford food on the table. Well, I want this privilege. Where's this privilege? The issue, I think, where it comes from is I think the real meaning behind it is, it's what certain things do we have in our life that helped us achieve certain things. I'll give you an example. I always look at myself and I think, like, that I was privileged enough to do certain things. So I was born to a middle class family. I never had to work when I was a kid. My parents made enough money that we weren't wealthy, but we had enough money that I always got everything I needed. I was also a single child, only child, so there was no siblings to worry about. So, for example, I got to go to a lot of social programs when I was in my teen years. I got to go to really amazing camps or volunteer programs that I was able to do. And that didn't only build for me many different connections, but it also gave me a much more richer upbringing, and I gained a lot of understanding and intelligence about the world and my surroundings. However, friends that I have who, their parents didn't come from a good background, they had to work, and they had, from the age of 13 or 14, they were already working in a pizza shop every single day after school, at their friends, or in the summers, they would have to work all summer as a babysitter. So they weren't able to get the same opportunities that I was able to get. And then same thing with the Army. There are people in the Army who they can't actually have a normal service. They get exemptions to take off a certain amount of days and then go work because they have to supply money for their families, while I could just have a normal service because I don't have that issue. Also, my parents live in a relatively high socioeconomic neighborhood where my family lives. Even if we aren't, I'm surrounded by people. I've been at Shabbat dinners with people who were former ambassadors, people who were former high government officials. I've met individuals who have traveled the entire world, and once in a while, these different individuals that I met gave me opportunities or gave me advice, or just led me in the right direction that helped me achieve a lot of different things. So, but a child who was born in, for example, a low socioeconomic area in Israel, he's not going to be around those people. He's going to be around individuals who are poor, who are just struggling, who are just trying to make ends meet. He's not going to be meeting these very famous or wealthy or very intelligent individuals who can help them achieve a lot in their lives. And so then when I'm going to finish my university and I'm going to get a job, and suddenly I'm making a lot of money, and then I have kids, and then they have a really good life. And then this child who's struggling is not able to go to university because of this. He's then going to have a family, and they're going to be born into the same mess that he was. And it continues. So then the question is, did I earn anything? Was it just my privilege that gave me my position? So I think it's not about I didn't earn anything because I'm privileged. It's I should be aware of certain things in my life that helped me achieve what I did. That I had an easier time achieving certain things than other individuals would have. there could be a child out there who was the same IQ as me, who has the exact same knowledge that I do, as in when we were young, that we were exactly the same in terms of what we could have both achieved. But I simply had much more opportunities than he did.
So it's it's almost there were less hurdles in your way than somebody maybe coming from a not so off background. It's kind of bringing me back to school in the UK, where certain students would have what we call free school meals, not so off background. It's kind of bringing me back to school in the UK, where certain students.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me okay? There was just a bit of a lag. There was a bit of a lag there. I'm sorry. I don't know what happened.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just getting on to the point where, you know, certain students would have free school meals if they came from a certain background. And I think that was a move that was made that actually really does help kids in those situations that might not get a healthy meal at home, right? They might not get what the nutrition that they need at home because either both the parents are working, or maybe they're from a single parent family. Many different issues. And there was recently a footballer, Marcus Rashford, in England, who actually campaigned to keep that program alive and keep the free school meals program alive, which I think is fantastic. With regards to what you were saying about privilege, how do you think it manifests itself in school? And is it something that was very obvious for you to see, like the differences between certain kids and the opportunities that some got and some didn't?
So when I was a kid, of course, you know, understanding the more political or having a better awareness of the situation around me, I didn't. Like most kids, all you really care about is what's in front of you. You're not really looking at the larger picture. But for example, as a kid, it would, you know, the kids who were better looking, or the kids who were able to just speak better than someone else, suddenly they got all the opportunities or something. So as a child, you see certain things that allowed others to achieve more. Or simply, for example, a really good example is there was a girl in my class, I think it was in 4th grade. I never forget this story. So we had a contest where in every single cereal box and every single type of box, there was a certain coupon that you could get. And they did a raffle in our school that whoever could collect the most of these coupons, every single coupon was a raffle ticket for a new bike. And one of the girls in the class, she had a father who worked with this stuff. So she came with bundles and bundles and bundles of these raffle tickets. In the end, however, there was another girl in our class who only put in one raffle ticket. She won, the girl who only put in one, and not the girl who put in a lot. But I think this was, for example, that situation was the first time about, you know, that was a privilege that this girl had, that she had the privilege to be able to put in so many raffle tickets because of her father, where her father worked. But then again, just in terms of when people say like, well, for example, in America, you say blacks are significantly more disadvantaged than white people. Well, look at all these individuals who are black who have succeeded. And I would go back to discussing that, you know, it doesn't mean that they didn't succeed, but we also have to look when we look at society and sociology and stuff like that, we have to look at the whole. And while, yes, this girl in my class who only put the one raffle ticket won, in the majority of cases, she's not going to win against the girl who put in a ton. And so why do we need to know this? Like, what's the importance? So I think this goes back to your saying, were you aware of this? What does it mean if I'm aware of it? Does this mean that, you know, me being a white person, it means that I shouldn't get the opportunities, or you shouldn't be allowed into university because you had it was easier for you to get here? No, I don't believe in that type of affirmative action. I think affirmative action, so that's affirmative action. Affirmative action is essentially trying to level out the playing field. So for example, if there's a predominantly white acceptance rate based on previous assumptions or simply socioeconomic factors that allowed for that, then you only allow people from a a certain colored background into the university to try to level that out. I personally think it does just the opposite, because I think that when you do that, what you're essentially doing for the future is then jobs will simply say, it was so much harder for a white person to get in the university now because it was so easy for an individual who is of color. And so now we're going to only let the white people in because we see that they had to work a lot harder. I think when it comes to communities that are disenfranchised, it doesn't matter whether they're black, white, any community that's disenfranchised by society, we have to see why. We need to understand what are the reasons that have led up to this, and what can we do as a society that can help them out. For example, it's also how we look at people. I think the term, just work more or just you're lazy is very problematic. I don't think that it helps in general with pushing society forward. It's important for us to understand how we can help. I think when I'm looking at the individuals who are around me, for example, kids, I think the best example is when we talked about children who have to work because their parents can't help. And the children are the ones who have to become the mother and the father and the breadwinner. That we should then focus on social programs that help so that every single kid can get a proper education and doesn't have to focus on working hard for the faults of the parents. And then whether or not it's actually the faults of the parents, was the both parents simply gamblers, or it was more other socioeconomic factors. However, then you could say, well, they are both gamblers because they were from this certain neighborhood that grew them up in this. That's why I don't like playing the blame game and who's to blame. Instead, we should be focusing a lot more on how can we improve society. So that's what I think a lot of times what the left is actually trying to say. It's that we want to improve society. We see a lot of different groups that are disenfranchised who haven't gotten the types of benefits and privileges that a certain aspect of the society has, and we want everyone to start from an equal footing as much as possible. That's the argument that I see, that I completely agree with. And I think that's what, when we talk about privilege, we should say, I was able to succeed these certain aspects of my life to help me succeed. How can I use this position of power or this position of privilege to then help other individuals also achieve what I achieved, who didn't have the same opportunities as I did?
So basically, giving someone a hand up. If you're a person that has had certain advantages or certain privileges, making sure that people that may have had a trickier upbringing, managing to bring them along with you and making sure that they have, if not full equality, like the chances of a life, a good life, a good work life, a balanced life. And I think that's it's great in principle. I'm just wondering how race plays into it, because I don't think that race should have anything to do with any of it, really, because you can have anyone from any background that comes from, either a high or low socioeconomical background. So I don't know if race really should play into any of this. What are your kind of thoughts on that?
So I think it's a misconception when we talk about race and how race plays a role. It really depends on what was the reason. For example, did I have a harder time, for example, so I, when I moved to Israel for the first few years of my life as, a white American who came to Israel, I suffered a lot of discrimination and racism from my fellow classmates who were of more Mizrahi and stuff, because that's just how it is. When you are the minority in a majority of a certain type of person, you're going to get discriminated against. So I felt that discrimination, and that harmed me. It didn't. For example, I had a very hard time speaking Hebrew for many years because of the discrimination that I got from that. So then I could have said that. So that was discrimination based on my skin color, based on my ethnic, my background. So when we talk about race, so what do we do about that? When you're looking back on why, for example, if you talk about America, why are Blacks statistically more disenfranchised than whites by numbers? It goes back to slavery. And the reason why slavery is still relevant in that aspect is because where individuals who are white in America starting off compared to where Black people were starting off is whites already had a few hundred years to, build wealth and build communities and build up their fortunes before Blacks were ever allowed to participate in society. And they were able to participate, they weren't even allowed to vote until a certain year. and they weren't even able to be equal citizens until then. So with their starting line, you both started at completely different starting lines to get to the finish line, completely. And so, but that comes from a racial issue. However, how do we actually fix the problem? We have to look at what actually helps these communities now. So the racism that instigated slavery is no longer a factor because slavery isn't in the United States, for example. But now I think instead of focusing on the racial aspects of it, we should just focus on the economic aspects of it. Right now, that's what disenfranchises the majority. White people, black people, brown people, any individual from any type, any racial background, these are all, the majority of them are disenfranchised today because of economic factors. Where the economic factors come from depends on different factors, whether it's due to immigration, when they immigrated to the country and they came with nothing, or whether or not it's due to slavery that they were under their forefathers. But today they all are equally under economic barriers. And so that is, I agree with you in terms of the fact that it does derive from a racial foundation, but right now the fix to it is economic. Instead of focusing on how do we help black people, and it should be how do we focus on uplifting the lower classes of the society. And in hindsight, you're at the end of the day, you're going to be, the majority of people that you're going to be helping with these new policies is going to be individuals of color. But you are also going to be helping along the way individuals who aren't, for example, white people. You're still going to be helping them because it's a more utilitarian way of seeing things, of like helping everyone out of it, the rut. And then it doesn't create this divisiveness of why are you only helping them and not us?
Which that I think is very key. Because, you know, from my experience in my secondary school or high school, if you like, in the UK, we had people from really all sorts of backgrounds. We had refugees from Iraq, from Iran. We had black kids, Indian kids, white kids, working class English kids. We had literally everything, Irish kids. And, you know, it wasn't just one certain group of kids that had issues. It was a range, you know, and you could see that, you know, it was all sorts of people from all sorts of backgrounds. And there was support there for them, but not enough. It wasn't like I saw any of these kids that had, you know, severe disruptive behavior and stuff like that. I didn't really see things improve, even though they did have like, you know, separate classes where they could go and get a different type of education outside of the formal type. So there definitely is more needed and more to be done within education to try and close the gap and to try and see things more holistically. I did want to move on to another topic, Tal, which I'd love if you could explain it to me, because I'm not, obviously I know what woke culture kind of is and what woke means, but I'm not, you know, completely aware of the kind of implications and how the left see it and how the right see it. So I was wondering if you could give us like a little bit of a definition of wokeness and woke culture, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
I think the most general term, in terms from a neutral point of view of defining woke culture individuals, is I think it's a hyper focus on activism, on political activism. It's this hyper focus on trying to see everything through the lens of social activism and helping different individuals and trying to, you know, fix everything, kind of like a social justice type of a warrior, as some would say, someone who's, you know, they want to help everyone, they want to do everything, they're trying, they don't want to offend anyone, they want to everyone to, it's kind of like they want a idealist utilitarian kumbaya type society, individuals who are trying to do everything in their possible might, that everything is going to be equal and okay and we're all going to live happily, which I don't think is a bad way of viewing things. I don't think that realistically the world works like that personally, but that's the ideal I think that they come with, people like that. You know, the fact that they are constantly focused on, you know, is this language okay? Should I be changing my language for this? Is this allowed to be said? Is this not allowed to be said? Should I, you know, we should change the way that we speak. We should change the way that we dress, look, say things, simply not to offend anyone else. because offending means harming other individuals, and we don't want to do that. So that's how I would, like generally term it.
I see. So let's say someone like myself who, I really care about the environment and nature, and it really bothers me every time there's an ecological disaster in Israel, or if it's anywhere else in the world, it really bothers me. Would that be considered woke, or is that just me caring about the planet and caring about our environment?
It mainly is focused on racial prejudice and discrimination. Those are the main things. It's mainly those type of topics, not environmental. It's mainly people are focused on looking through the lenses of race and looking through the lenses of like just how are you just. It's about offending people mainly. It's about how we're harming other individuals around us.
I see. So I do remember like a debate about the way we use language in the UK about describing certain football players, and then there was a debate of whether it's right to use certain language and certain terminology. Let's say for a big strong guy, striker playing football, they would call him like what a beast, and is that wise to use that kind of language for a certain type of person? Now, personally, I think you can take it either way, right? You can use that language and say, okay, that's derogatory. Calling someone a beast is like referring to them as an animal, and it's really unkind. Or you can look at it and as something positive. You're saying to someone, wow, look how strong he is, look how powerful he is, look at what a good sportsman he is, by saying that. So it's kind of a catch-22. People can kind of take language the way they want. How do you what's the kind of line, do you think, and how can we know when language is being used in a derogatory way, or it's just being used as a way to describe somebody or something?
The issue with this is that there is no way. At the end of the day, if I'm, you did, for example, the term, for example, you fight like a girl. That term, like you fight like a girl, it's usually used in a very derogatory manner. But what if I see women, like I come from a background where I, like my sister was a female fighter, and I know women in my friend groups who are like these professional boxers. So I'm like, you fight like a girl. Of course, that's not what the meaning is. It's very well known. That's the thing. That's a meaning that we know is completely derogatory. It's meant to look at women as unable to fight, unable to fend for themselves. But with a lot of things in society is we don't know. For example, then the question is when do we draw the line between, for example, when you're just making a joke or you're just being with your friends, and when you're saying something that's incredibly offensive to individuals, or you're doing it on purpose? Because it's very easy, for example, where I see it a lot, where people say incredibly offensive things to individuals looking for a reaction, and then when they get called out for it, they're, no, it's just a joke. I'm just joking with you. And then I'm talking about people saying like we should gas, like for example, I've seen things like we should gas all the Jews again. And then when you say something, it's like, oh, it's just a joke. Why are you getting offended? I'm just joking with you. But so the question is like, where is the line? For example, if my good friend said that to me as a joke, like, yo, I'm gonna gas you, dude, or something, like some dumb joke, then I would understand because I know him as a person. And so I would know that he's just joking with me. But if you were just randomly on the street and I said that to you, that's not the connotation you would get. And so the same thing, for example, a friend of mine who works in a prison. So she was with the prisoners, and many of the individuals who were there were from Ethiopian background, so they were black, and they were all being very riley. They were all kind of like getting upset, and they weren't being quiet. She said, "I don't understand. What is this, a jungle here?" And she meant it in terms of like people losing control. And then one of them said to her, like, what, because we're black, we're monkeys or something like that? And she got really scared, like, because she didn't mean that at all. She just simply meant, like, what are we in a jungle? Like, we're all, like, going crazy. And then they said, no, we're just joking with you. But that's a question. For example, if that happens, then what do you say? Like, that. Also, what did the person mean at the end of the day? If someone says that to me, how do I know that they're not just, it's also about what is the meaning of these different terms, because we also come from different backgrounds. And so our understanding of the different words, for example, the N-word. So, for example, why don't I say the N-word? Even if I, for example, would say it to my friend, the reason I don't say it is simply because I know that it's incredibly offensive terminology for many individuals, and so I'd rather not say it simply because it doesn't harm me to not say it. It doesn't take away from my freedom and what I'm trying to say by not saying that word. But someone, for example, who lives in a completely different part of the country, who has no history of understanding of America. I've heard friends of mine who have said the word to each other and they have no understanding of the racial history behind it. So what happens if an American individual who's a person of color comes here and then you walk, hey, what's up, my N-word? But he's just meaning it as a friend because he just heard the word on TV and so he's saying it because he thinks, oh, it's an American term that they use.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's a question because you could say, well, no, he wasn't being offended. He was just, that he doesn't know. But that's the issue is we don't always know what people mean when they're saying like they're a beast. That's pretty well known that it's a good terminology. But like for example, what if I said that they, for example, in like what if I said that the black athletes like they're strong like gorillas? How would that be taken? Because maybe gorillas are big, they're strong, they're incredibly powerful, but it's also there's a history of that word of in racial science of black people being compared to monkeys and apes. And so the question is then what do I mean? So I think it's a problem of definitions, how we all define words very differently from one another.
Yeah, I get that, and it's a very tricky, very tricky issue. One thing that did kind of pop into my mind is, do you think these days there's a bit of an oversensitivity with regards to the use of certain words, and people can jump the gun and get offended when there's nothing to be offended, and then sometimes when there's actual reason to be offended, we don't know how to differentiate.
Yeah, so this goes back to definitions. It goes back to us not knowing what people actually mean behind the scenes, and also think about it. For example, misgendering someone. When people, for example, there's a much more bigger thing about a spectrum of gender identity and how people view themselves. And so, if a friend of mine comes up to me and if I go up to someone who sees themselves as transgender and they identify as a man. And then I don't know that. I just go up to them and say, hey, how are you? And then I look at my friend like, hey, she wants to come with us. The question then is that how she takes it, but then it also depends on her personal experiences. Has she been facing a lot of discrimination and a lot of people saying, I refuse to call you by your preferred pronouns. And so screw you, I'll call you whatever I want. And so maybe she thinks that I'm just another one of these people. Or maybe I simply just didn't know and I just misgendered her. So, and then the problem is when weird situations come about of someone really, then she doesn't know at that point anymore because, well, are they actually just trying to be cheeky with me and trying to offend me on purpose, or do they really not know? The problem with that is it takes understanding. You need to understand who the people are. I have times when I'm having political discussions with individuals and I discuss a certain topic. For example, I would say that I'm a person who will openly discuss anything wrong that Israel has ever done or with Palestine. I'm very open about my beliefs with that. But I'll be talking maybe about things that Palestinians have done, and a Palestinian in the chat will say, hey, what about Israel? Why aren't you talking about Israel? Because he doesn't know me. He doesn't know what I've done in the past, and he doesn't know what I've talked about. And so he assumes that I'm simply not looking, I don't care about what Israel does, and I only focus on the Palestinians. So that's the issue, is that we're all coming from entirely different backgrounds, and suddenly we're all forced together either in these online calls or in the online spaces, and then also in real life when there are counter protests with one another, and we don't know what to do anymore because we're all coming from different backgrounds and we all treat things very differently.
Yeah, indeed. One of the next topic that I did want to get onto, Tal, is virtue signaling, because I'm not too sure how to define it and how to say if somebody is actually doing it or if they're genuinely trying to support a certain cause or issue. So can we take a look at that, please?
Yeah, so the meaning is actually a more negative one, so I'll just define it the best. I think Wikipedia does it well. Virtue signaling is a prerogative term for the expression of a moral viewpoint with the intent of communicating good character. So it's people essentially, it's like holding up, like for example, a really good example of this was when different right-wing channels or even right-wing channels went up to like different BLM protesters and asked them like different statistics or questions, and they had no idea how to answer them. And they were like, we're just here to support. But in a sense, they're there because they want to feel good about themselves. Going to a protest and having no idea why you're actually there is virtue signaling in my eyes. Like it's essentially, I want to feel good. It's like when you saw the videos pop up of people at protests just taking photos of themselves because they want to look good. I am woke. I care about racial bias and discrimination. Look at me holding up this flag. Or when people, for example, instead of actually talking about issues that were going on with the Black Lives Matter movement, they just put up a black square of saying, like, I care about them. But after that, they go back to doing what they did. They don't actually care. Right. They did it because everyone else did it.
Right.
So that's that. It's essentially just latching on to different movements or serious issues just because you want to feel good about yourself.
I see. So could we say like it's people that jump on the bandwagon of either any side? So with regards to Israel, Palestine, it could be people that are not involved, like they don't have any connection to Israel or Palestine or to the conflict, yet they choose a certain side and support them kind of blindly. Would that be virtue signaling?
It's just that's also, there's other issues with that also about people just blindly following certain beliefs simply because they heard one side first and now they believe them. But it also destroys the movement itself because when you have, for example, I saw this pro-Palestinian TikToker who was upset with individuals saying like stop writing Free Palestine on random Jewish people posts because it just takes away from our movement, because by doing so it just delegitimizes us. When you do this, like, stop doing it. This was a Palestinian woman, and I've also seen Israelis the same thing where they'll just randomly comment on Palestinian activists, like just Israeli flags. Like there's no reason to comment. That doesn't help. Like you haven't solved the conflict by just being a nuisance to people. But people do it because they're like, you know what, I'm gonna be the big activist, I'm gonna save everything, and I'm gonna be able to, but that's I think that's more, that goes to wokeness, for example. That already goes to like me, I think I'm better than you and I'm going to show you why you're wrong, and this is why this is the right path and you're wrong. And then virtue signaling is a lot more, I think virtue signaling is a lot more with a bad intent because you're only doing it for your own personal gain, not because you actually care.
So I can remember seeing an interview with AOC, the politician in the States, and they asked her about the Palestinian cause, and she has great support for the Palestinians. Yet when the interview asked her the difference between the West Bank and Gaza, she had no clue. So would she be someone that would be considered to be virtue signaling?
I think in that sense, yes, because it's a politician trying to gain. She's considered on the left wing of American politics, and therefore she needs to gain support by the left wing. And right now, different movements, for example, to support the Palestinians, Black Lives Matter, other different social groups, this is what gets them votes. The fact that a mainstream, very powerful, at the end of the day, she wants to get, she's, from what I understood from her followers, and she wants to be a very powerful figure in American politics. And the fact that you can't even tell a very, very simple geographical difference in this area shows ignorance and just a lack of actually willing to want to understand the conflict and simply siding with whatever sounds good or whatever is going to help me win in the polls. Because people don't realize that these things have action. When individuals in positions of power, they go out and support something that they don't actually know what they're doing, they might not care about it and they might think it doesn't affect anything, but this can have lasting effects. There could be individuals who follow AOC and truly support what she truly support her, and then just blindly support a movement without actually knowing anything about it because some politician told them to, instead of actually knowing that the politician actually knows what they're talking about.
I see. So in that sense, you can't really trust a politician that does those kind of things, because there might be, another issue that you care about, and they might just jump on the bandwagon again and go with whatever will get them the votes. Unfortunately.
So this So actually, I want to take us to the chat because there's a really good discussion coming from Superman. I think it's actually it. I really like the dog, by the way, if that's yours. I'm going to read just the last part. This is in regard to AOC. Yes, but just because she's ignorant doesn't mean she's wrong. She's trying to give a voice to the Palestinian people's needs, which are void of a voice in America. And then politicians imperfectly support Israel, and there's no worry about them saying things that are a little too far, which happens plenty. So in regard to your first point, I don't disagree. I don't agree with this take. Simply because I don't think that you should support any side and not know what you're talking about. I personally have a big issue with that. Because then my real question is, do you actually know what happened? Do you actually know the history? But you can't actually. It's like me saying that I support the independence of a certain country, but I couldn't even tell you where that country is on the map. So the question is, how much do you actually know about what's happening there? How much do you know that you're actually supporting a just cause? And that's my issue. No one should be supporting a cause that they have nothing, even basic information about. If you can't tell me very basic information of the Palestinians' history, of the Palestinian people, and history of the state of Israel, then my question is, how do you actually know what's going on here to any extent? If you can't even tell me this little information. In regard to the other take, this goes back exactly, Amir, to what I said about you. I hate anyone who does this type of stuff and only, supports Israel very blindly and it's like the state of Israel is the best place in the world and the Palestinians are horrible monsters and we have to take care of them all. Like, I hate all of them. They're no different than AOC in my mind in terms of blind support. It's not. I also don't. I think it's a kind of whataboutism, because just because AOC does it doesn't mean that just because the Israelis, pro-Israel politicians that you mentioned do this doesn't mean AOC should do it either. They're both wrong for doing this. Both should be called out. And I constantly do call them both out. I don't care which side you follow. If you post false information, I'll call you out on it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you there, Tal. And, Israel is a good country, but I think calling it, the best country in the world, or the greatest, or, Or Goim, or anything like that, I can't really see it, to be honest with you, with the state of affairs at the moment.
That, though. It's also, there's no such thing as perfection. Like, that's another issue. But this goes back to what we discussed about the privilege and looking at the history of a country. If you say that the country is perfect, then you're not going to look at the imperfections of the people. You're not going to be look at the imperfections of the country. If the country is perfect, then there's no imperfections. No, Israel's another country just like any other, and we have to look at the issues of Israel. We have to look at the background of Israel. We have to look at the problems with Israel, and we base it on that. I live in Israel because of this, and this. I mean, when you say Israel, what I do agree is you could say Israel has an amazing health system. Israel has an amazing security system. Israel has an amazing prime minister, and for this and this the reason. But I don't generic. The best country. There's no country that's the best. Every country has different things that it's good in and bad in, and you have to base it on that.
For sure. We have to look critically at each kind of issue. Like I've always said, when it comes to dealing with problems with
You froze.
In Israel, like the issue of car accidents and road accidents, that's one issue that we're having. The issue with illegal weapons, the conflict with the Palestinians, that's another issue. And it would help if to make actions and improve those issues one by one. The roads, the car, really a huge problem, and I'd love to see legislation to these accidents. because issues.
Mm-hmm. Just I heard everything you said, but you're breaking up, like you're lagging.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, let me see.
Maybe just
if I
for
can...
me.
No, I think there's a little bit of an issue here with
No,
the
you're better
internet.
now. I can hear you again though.
Okay, fantastic. Fantastic.
So going into, again, I think it's really, I want to focus a lot on chat because I think chat's really bringing up a lot of interesting discuss. So the Dunning-Kreger effect is essentially where I don't want to sum it up myself. I'm just going to look at the exact, I know what it is, but I don't want to sum it up incorrectly. The Dunning-Kreger effect is a hypothetical cognitive bias stating that people with low ability at a task overestimate their own ability, and that people with high ability task underestimate their ability. And also in regard to what she or he said about the fact that we won't always have enough information. That's true. At the end of the day, you're not going to have all the information. I am currently studying the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in university. I've been interested in the field since I was 14, and every single time I open a book, I'm learning more and more information. There's a difference between you not knowing for example, which year Arafat rose to power as the head of the PLO, and you not knowing where the West Bank is. That's the thing. And it's like, for example, if I were to say to you, you having issues with America, for example, if you don't know a certain topic or a certain field and stuff like that, or I don't expect every single person who discusses the conflict to know where every single town is in Israel. But if you can't tell me the differences between the West Bank and Gaza, and where Gaza is and where Israel is, which is a very fundamental part of the conflict,
for sure,
understanding the differences between the West Bank and Gaza is very, very, it's one of the basic parts of the conflict because it's so fundamental to understanding the conflict. Then that is like, you shouldn't be speaking about the topic. I don't expect you to know everything. I don't expect myself to know everything. I've had conversations where suddenly people told me about a certain event, or there are a lot of different things about the Palestinian narrative that I only learned about in the last few years because I just didn't know to ask the right questions. But not having the basic information about a country or about a conflict does make you not. For example, it's like me saying that I support the Northern Ireland against the British, but you don't even know who the British are. You just know that I'm against because of the British, but I don't know who the British are. That's the issue, is you have to have a certain basis of knowledge to be able to really have an opinion on anything. And if not, then you shouldn't have an opinion on it. If I don't even know what China is or where China is, then I can't start criticizing the place if I don't even understand what it is. Because who knows, I might be completely wrong if I'm not even having a basic understanding. You could be wrong later on, but that's a difference of while you're wrong. Did you maybe read the false information? Were you lied to? But if you're not coming with a basic understanding of the conflict, of any conflict, then you shouldn't speak on it.
For sure. People should definitely educate themselves more before going out there and supporting either side. I remember when we had you on last time and we were speaking about the conflict that happened back in May. The things I saw online, I was really, really shocked. Maybe I'm a bit naive because I just got into this whole podcasting and social media world quite recently, like let's say within the last year and a half. And I didn't really see what was going on, and to see the levels of hatred and things being pumped through the social media, the Instagrams, the TikToks, I'm really taken aback by it. And I guess it comes down to like copycat behavior, right? Like it's people seeing other people behave in a certain way and copying, certain messages and unfortunately propagating hate online, where I want to go into the next subject that we wanted to talk a little bit about, which is trigger warnings, because I don't exactly get the term. I'll be honest with you. Kane explained it to me as it's like a warning before you say something that could offend somebody. Is that more or less correct?
Yeah, it's something. It originates more from, for example, with adding it before strobe lights are flashing on the screen because of people with epilepsy. Like that's kind of like where it came from, like trigger warning, where people would put warning on or stuff like that. Yeah, but it's essentially that. It's warning people of something that is going to happen on the screen that could be not just offensive, but could be problematic for certain individuals to see. It's like a warning beforehand, just in case.
I see.
That's where it comes. So, trigger warnings. It's a complex subject because it does come down to, you're at the end of the day, anything you say is going to. The way that I put it, this goes back to when I discussed why I don't say the N-word, for example, is when there's a certain thing that you say in public and it's going to offend someone. My question that I think you should ponder is, do you need to say this? Is this something that you need to say? Is this something that gets your opinion across? Is the only way that I could discuss the conflict is if I have to say this word, then you're going to have to say it. I believe that you should have to say it. I mean, if you have a good enough reason. For example, me calling, me discussing Israel and Palestine or the Palestinians, there are people who are pro-Palestinian that would be offended by me saying Israel as a state of Israel because they don't want me to say Israel. They shouldn't say no because they don't believe in Israel's right to exist. So I shouldn't acknowledge Israel. As in, when people say, like, for example, that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, and then say Israel doesn't exist. Like, for example, when people discuss Israel and they say, what country are you talking about? Israel doesn't exist. This also happens with Palestinians, where Palestinians will talk about themselves and there's like, you guys don't exist. What are you guys talking about? So, for example, I won't change my language because for me and my own political beliefs, it's something that's inherent to my political philosophy and opinions that I will say Israel. But saying the N-word or saying other terminology, for example, the F word, that is a slur against people who are homosexuals, these aren't words that I need to say that get my point across about certain topics. And so I won't say them so I don't have to offend certain groups. So I think it's all about also as a society trying to be respectful of the people around us to an extent. It's like, I don't have an issue with seeing violence or sexual things in a movie that I'm watching. But for example, someone who might come from a religious background, who they don't want to see that, they don't want to see sexual content. So I think it's good. I think it's good that the movie should show hand before. So, hey, just so you know, this doesn't just suddenly pop on the screen. And then, like, why should I have to, like, for example, a lot of ultra-Orthodox individuals don't let their kids have phones just for this reason, is because they don't want their kids to go on phones and then they literally click a random page and suddenly, like a naked person pops up, which to them is incredibly offensive and they don't want to have to see the naked body. It's egregious in their practices. And so by having trigger warnings, it allows individuals who have certain things that are very harmful to them to navigate the internet. When people talk about, well, I hate triggers, it's funny when, for example, when people who come from a more conservative or more right-wing narrative say they don't like trigger warnings. For example, people who are veterans from war, putting a trigger warning that this could induce PTSD because of the sounds of explosions or gunfire or the screams of soldiers dying, putting that before. So in case they watch a movie that doesn't look like it's going to have any of these things, to warn you like beforehand, so you don't have to have an episode in the middle of the movie theater, which can be very embarrassing for them to have everyone stare at them when they're having these episodes. So trigger warnings, I think, it goes back to trying to not harm the people around us and trying to be considerate. It does go to extremes sometimes, where I've seen people, for example, I don't see an issue with it, but for example, I've seen people like, where it's like a trigger warning, glasses, shoes, stuff like that, or like it's more extreme. I haven't seen that mainstream, but I don't see an issue with triggers. But I also think that there is, to an extent, however, of responsibility of yourself. For example, if you have a really hard time with, for example, me as a pescatarian or you as a vegetarian, I don't think that I should always 100% of the time have to trust that every establishment or every single place is going to make sure it doesn't have meat. I should say, like, hey, just so you know, I don't eat meat. Can you make sure that not to give me some? Would it be nice if they would have a sign up that said, like, hey, this food is might have meat in it? Yeah, of course. But that's not always going to happen. I think it's also about realizing that the world doesn't revolve around you. and that not all the
For
time
sure.
people are going to be able to take your own considerations your own needs into consideration, and therefore you're going to have to try to a certain extent also to warn the people around you of what might happen. If I can't go out to the fireworks show because it could trigger PTSD. I can't go to this restaurant because I might eat non-kosher food, or I might eat piece of meat. So I think it's about trying to do a balance and trying to see like how much we can push it and stuff like that. It's helpful.
I see. We do have a couple of comments here with regards to trigger warnings that I'd like you to address, Tal. So the first one is here. I do not think trigger warnings are real. I've basically never seen that on anything from a left-wing space.
So this would go back to me. This would just be anecdotal from my side or her side. Like there's no her side, his side. I just want to make sure I'm gender, like if you're a guy or girl, however you but Superman, that would just be entirely anecdotal. There's no like debate there. Like I can't tell you what your experiences were. My personal experiences with left-wing spaces is there are those things of certain things you don't say. They don't always call it trigger warnings. It's just certain things that you don't say. For example, of certain things that you should be careful about saying that could have a negative reaction. But that's more anecdotal. That it's just my personal experiences against yours. But interesting.
I see. And we do have another one here by Jordan.
And that's really interesting. I saw that in the chat. Jordan, if you could link the article, send it to my Twitter. It's the same. It's Tal Hagin, just like the strudel Tal Hagin, and link it to me. I'd love to read the paper. Like I'm very curious about why that does that, like where that comes from.
Yeah, that is quite interesting. I can remember. I don't know if this is in relation to what we're speaking about, but before certain movies or music videos, there might be a warning about people who have epilepsy, and that the flashing lights and stuff can trigger an epileptic fit. Would that be considered as well a trigger warning?
Yeah, that's a trigger warning.
Yeah. Okay.
I think there's trigger warnings that are now this would be controversial because of course individuals who do have triggers for example, trigger warning homophobic content, for example, because they've had so many slurs against them as a individual who's homosexual. So it's very hard for them to listen to like very, very, like the F slur and other things against them. But this is just, I would say, I personally would categorize it as medical trigger warnings and then social trigger warnings. That there's the medical, for example, peanuts and types of things, meat, not from you being vegan, but a lot of people who don't eat meat is because of medical issues. Same thing with epilepsy. That there are medical trigger warnings. PTSD is also a medical trigger warning. Trigger warnings that are essential from a medical standpoint of like these things can really like trigger something in the individuals that they cannot control to any extent. And then I would say social trigger warnings is triggers that we put to try to alleviate pain and hardships that certain individuals will get from viewing this type of content or being open to certain types of content. But it doesn't delegitimize them at all. I'm just saying, like, I see a difference with them in terms of the types. What we're aware. I've seen that historically, a lot more people have been okay with medical trigger warnings, but social trigger warnings have been politicized.
I see what you mean. So whereas medically it's seen as okay, we can, we have to do this, which is something here in the comment as well.
Yeah, required by law trigger warning.
Yeah, and whereas social ones are like kind of, like you said, seen as a political issue, you're taking either or side. I did want to move on to our last topic because I think this is one that I've heard this used obviously a lot in like online forums and communities, but in England or in Israel, I've never really come across them or actually know what they are. So with regards to safe spaces, how would you define a safe space and what exactly does that mean?
So a safe space would be it's a place for a group that is either marginalized, discriminated against, individuals who don't always feel like they can communicate around other individuals certain ideas, and so there's a certain area, safe space, where they can actually discuss ideas without having to worry about negative or problematic individuals. In terms of safe spaces, of how real they are, I mean, they do exist. For example, having a place, for example, where only certain people with certain political beliefs can exist is a safe space. Having a room where only pro-Israelis can be, if you're pro-Israel, come and speak, that's a safe space. A safe space is essentially it's a defensive echo chamber. That's how I would term it. It's individuals who want to be able to express certain ideas. But sorry, for example, think about it, how a lot of like women that I've known, where, you know, whenever they're in the room and they want to voice their opinions, a lot of times men will speak up against them because of how it's worked against with women being like spoken over by a guy. So a space would be a place where there's just women who are speaking, because then they don't have to worry about a guy speaking over them. Or a place, for example, a forum where there's Palestinians and Israelis, but there's more Israelis in the room. So it's going to be a lot harder for the Palestinians to say anything that they want to, because they're going to be surrounded by individuals who are every second going to say, but wait, but what about this? But what about this? So then they'd rather be in a place where it's just people who are Palestinians or just pro-Palestinian, so then they can actually express themselves without constantly being shut down every 2 seconds. So the reason I say echo chamber is not because it is they want an echo chamber, but because I think that it just becomes an echo chamber at a certain point. Because then you don't have these counter views. But I don't think people choose to go into these type of spaces from that standpoint. I think they do it simply because they don't feel like their voice is heard sometimes in other spaces. And when you have a more powerful group that dominates certain spaces, then you want a place where you feel like you can actually express yourself.
I see. So it's almost like a bubble where you feel whatever your political views are or social views are, where you feel comfortable to express your views without having someone negate what you're saying or come at you with a different opinion.
Yeah, it's essentially like Schuberman talks about it, how the fact that, for example, in America, at least, it was white straight Christian males, but also who were, you know, from a certain status. If you were low and you didn't have money and you were just weak, then you also didn't have any. But those individuals, for example, they dominated a lot of different spaces and talks and discussions. And so as America moved towards more and more equality amongst the sexes and amongst the different races, then and also sexual identities, then it's slowly people trying to push back on this norm that was existed for so long, where, you know, if the white man's speaking, you don't speak because you don't want to get into a really, really bad problem with that person. But now it's like everyone should have an equal say when we're talking. So safe spaces are essentially they're new. Like the recent safe spaces that we keep hearing about are a newer phenomenon. But I think that, again, I think that it more runs away from the problem. Is I think that the individuals who are, for example, then again, this goes back to how much of a personal responsibility, for example, fighting up against in the space itself, fighting up against people saying like, but wait, and it's like, no, you wait, I'm speaking right now, which I do see. Sometimes I see spaces where people like they fight back, but a lot of people don't have that mentality of being able to like just stand up and be. A lot of people aren't like that, where they can just like speak to another person like that and say, no, you be quiet, I'm speaking now, I didn't get to speak. And so they'd rather go to a place where they actually feel like they can speak. But I think it leads to worse things. It's kind of like affirmative action, where I think that it leads to a problem down the line. The same thing with space, but with the echo chamber issue, it leads to that. It's not what it comes from, though.
Yeah, I see what you mean, because it can become problem. You know, if your views or how you kind of contextualize things can be very, very different to others. I actually did a podcast the other day, someone else's channel, a British Muslim girl who we've also had on the show, Zubayda El Arabi, and a lot of the things that she was saying about the Israel-Palestine conflict, were completely wrong, and you know, common misconceptions about things that are happening over here. And you almost need a place that's not a safe space for you to get that person to maybe see things a little bit differently, or to understand that they might have certain facts wrong, or they haven't put into historical context some of the things that went on. So I do think
it's also how I said
yeah.
earlier, how when I became open to more of the Palestinian narrative, there were a lot of things I learned simply because you don't know. It's not always about, well, why didn't you know about this event? Well, because you don't know the questions. If you don't know the event exists, you can't ask about the event. So suddenly, when I spoke to a lot more Palestinians in the last few years, when I became more open to actually having a discourse, and suddenly pushed myself to have a discourse, I heard about all these different events, and suddenly I was like, huh, I never heard about this, or this sounds weird to me, or this doesn't sound right. So then I researched them on my own, and there were some crazy, incredible things that I found out. But I would have never known about these things. I never would have questioned them if I wasn't forced to sit down and have this conversation. If I didn't force myself to have these conversations. So that's that.
Definitely. I think that, you know, the more we do discuss and the more we do you know, add to our knowledge about certain events, that way you can have a more broad perspective and maybe a wiser opinion about things that go on. I think especially with regards to the conflict over here, the Arab-Israeli conflict, or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, whatever way you want to look at it. You could do a doctorate on it and live here for 10, 20 years and not be aware of every single incident or everything that has gone on over here. So adding knowledge and adding perspective from other people, I think, is key to maybe solving these things in the long run. We are coming towards the end of our time for tonight, Tal, but it really has been, you know, a real education for me tonight, because a lot of these things I don't have a clue about, and you really have helped me to understand them. Is there anything you'd like to share with our viewers before we say goodbyes?
One thing that I think it's important to say is something, for example, and when I first heard, I came from a lot more of a right-wing household, and that's how I grew up. And so, you know, like I, for example, enjoyed watching all the like owning the feminists and owning the liberals compilations when they came out in 2016. Like that, I thought they were really cool and interesting and really intellectual. And for many years, I didn't. When you focus on the semantics and you focus on, you know, like the buzzwords and the trigger words and stuff like that, and you don't try to like, okay, let's see, what are they actually trying to say? You suddenly start to understand what the underlying, you can throw away all the buzzwords and all the screaming and all the yelling and all that, and what are they actually upset about? What is actually going on? What is the actual issues? Instead of focusing on the wording and what are people, it's like, for example, it's not Black Lives Matter, it's All Lives Matter. It's like, forget the wording. What are they actually fighting for? Let's ask that question. Who cares about what wording they use right now? Let's discuss what they actually are fighting for. A really good example of this is there was a Israeli, I forgot if she was a performer, exactly what she did. She was an activist, a performance activist, considered very left-wing in Israel. She went to the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, and she did a whole play where she called herself like that, I'm the Holocaust and I'm a slut to the Israeli government. And she started like a lot of very, very provocative things. Like she's at the Holocaust Memorial saying all this stuff. And Israelis really looked bad. Like no one like was in support of her. But I decided to listen to the entire thing. It was like 10 minutes. And I decided to just sit there and listen to what she had to say. And when I pushed through everything, all the really offensive and horrible things she was saying, I realized what she was saying was she was pissed off that Israel had, you know, talks about the Holocaust so much, but the fact that a lot of Holocaust survivors still, like, they live on the street, they live with barely any money, and that they're kind of, a lot of them are thrown to the side. And that's what it was about. It's that you use me for my past and you don't actually help me. And that was what the message was. But the
Very
message,
true.
but she decided that the way that she was going to promote the message to get people to look was doing this incredibly provocative thing, which was very provocative and incredibly offensive. And I don't agree with the ways that she did it. But I pushed through my own feelings and my own issues with it and said, what is she actually trying to say? And that would be my messages. And when you find someone being incredibly offensive, try to find out what they're actually saying. No matter whether they're being incredibly racist, whether they're being incredibly offensive, no matter what they're saying, try to see what are they actually saying. Because it might turn out that what they're saying actually has an underlying truth, and you can focus on that issue and not everything around and what they're actually saying. It's hard. It's very hard to hear certain things. It's like, for example, I watched this documentary about why the Holocaust didn't happen by a Holocaust denier. I watched, it was like 2 hours, and I watched the entire thing. And I realized that the main issue is they simply were starting from a false presumption that 6 million died in the gas chambers. That was their presumption throughout the entire video, disproving. But if I simply, they're Holocaust deniers, screw them, I'm not going to talk to them. But by then watching the video and trying to understand where they're coming from, saying, maybe they have some truth to them, I'm going to listen to what they have to say, I was able to then actually understand what their argument was and then be able to dissect it from an actual academic background and say, okay, this is why it's wrong. It's not wrong because it happened. Screw you. You're wrong because of this. This doesn't add up with this. And that's how I think that you should be looking at things, no matter how provocative they are. What are they actually trying to say? Where does it come from? And that would be my thing. Try to understand the underlying message.
I think that's a really, really mature way of going about things, Tal, and I think it's probably the best way and the best chance we have to actually educate people who are, like you said, Holocaust deniers or these kind of conspiratorial characters, is to look at the things that they're saying and dissect it, and then help educate them with regards to history and to things that happen. Especially when it comes to kind of Jewish conspiracies and Holocaust denial and things like that. So I think you really do. You have a very mature head on your young shoulders there, and we say in Hebrew, kol hakavod, all the respect and to you, and I think you're on a very good path, Tal. So definitely keep it up, my friend.
But surely.
Yeah, shwaya min Abdallah.
And I appreciate always coming on the podcast and discussing these issues. I think they're important to discuss and to dissect. And it was great being here again.
Definitely. And of course, you are welcome back anytime you like, Tal. It will be a real pleasure to have you on again. And I'm sure, unfortunately, some of the other members couldn't make it tonight, but I'm sure they would love you to come back, and maybe we can find a few more things to talk about. So for now, wishing everybody a good week, good start to the week. Shavua Tov. And please, guys, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. And we'd love to hear from you below in the comments. That's it. Tal, any last words for our viewers?
Thank you, and have a good night.
Thanks very much. Evening. Thank you. Or evening, wherever you are, really.
Morning, afternoon, wherever you are. Have a good day.
That's it.
Thank you very much.
Yalla. Bye, guys. Thank you for joining.